Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zaldra. It is my pleasure to introduce to you in today's episode a very well-known researcher in the philosophy of science. He is the Hans Reichenbach Professor and William F. Vilas Research Professor in the Department of Philosophy at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is someone who is among the leading contemporary contributors in the philosophy of biology. Today's episode guest is Dr. Elliott Sober. Elliot is first and foremost a philosopher of science, particularly concerning evolutionary biology and probability. One of Elliot's main fields of research has been the subject of simplicity or parsimony in connection with theory evaluation in science. He's also been interested in altruism, both as the concept is used in evolutionary biology and also as it is used in connection with human psychology. His book, The Nature of Selection, Evolutionary Theory in Philosophical Focus, has been instrumental in establishing the philosophy of biology as a prominent research area in philosophy. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the nature of selection marks the point at which most philosophers became aware of the philosophy of biology. In his review of the book, biologist Ernst Mayr wrote, "Sober has given us what is perhaps the most careful and penetrating analysis of the concept of natural selection as it affects the process of evolution." So for those of you who are familiar with Elliot and his work, I think you will really enjoy this episode. And for those of you just learning about Dr. Sober, I think this interview provides a great opportunity to understand how a philosopher of science can do great work that is not only relevant to philosophers of science and the scientists themselves, but to more traditional analytic philosophers as well. So, without further ado, let's bring in Dr. Elliott Sober. So, growing up, were your parents into academia, or did they do anything related to the sciences?
They both went to college, but they weren't academics, and they weren't scientists either. My father was a dentist. My mother was a public school teacher, and they were both the first generation of their families to go to college. My father, they both were in their 20s, young 20s, when the Depression began, and so they both were urged by their parents to do something practical, which is how they ended up where they were. My father, in retrospect, wished that he had been a historian rather than a dentist. So when I became interested in philosophy, neither of them discouraged me in the slightest. They thought it was wonderful that I could do something that they wished they had been able to do but were not able to do.
That's fascinating. That's really great to hear. So, did this interest in philosophy, was this something that came about in grade school, or was this something that started happening a little bit later?
I read some of the popular books that Bertrand Russell wrote when I was in junior high, which intrigued me. Partly because of the fantastic clarity with which they were written, but the subjects also interest me: religion and science, marriage and morals, these kinds of things. But I guess I started to get interested in philosophy as a subject in college, and I can explain how that went. It's sort of a circuitous route for someone who ended up in philosophy of science.
Yeah, absolutely. Share with us. Yeah.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I concluded just by observing the courses I was in that math and science did not involve thinking. It seemed like a mindless calculation or memorizing facts is what you did. So anyhow, when I went to college, I decided that I would take as little science and math as possible and do something interesting. And going to Penn in the 60s, in the days of student power, I was able to do what I wanted to do. I had an individualized major, which meant I could do whatever interested me. So I did almost no math or science. But what I found in the courses that interested me, which were mostly in literature and in history, I found most interesting questions questions that, of course, I would now call epistemological. I didn't know that word at first. I was interested in how you evaluate competing theories of why the French Revolution occurred, competing interpretations of a novel. And I gradually got interested in philosophy and realized that philosophy was the place where these subjects are studied, best. And inside of philosophy, I gravitated to philosophy of science as a subject that was, has theory evaluation as one of its main subjects. And then finally, after getting interested in philosophy of science, I realized that science is not a mindless activity. I should have known that earlier, but it took me a little bit of time to discover that. And so I got interested in science gradually, but only because I was interested in philosophy. And my impression is that philosophers of science usually have the reverse pathway. That is, they start off interested in science, and then they discover philosophy of science as an interesting discipline. But for me, it was the reverse.
Yeah, so I'm curious about beginning in philosophy, in particular, reading even some philosophical texts in junior high, which is starting off at a pretty young age. How did you develop this idea that math and, for the most part, math and science were number crunching, mindless thinking kinds of activities?
It wasn't sort of reading some attack on math and science that made me think. It was just by observing what the classes were that I took. Which, I kind of enjoyed them, but I didn't think it was very challenging, and it was just not interesting to me. So it was just like an empirical generalization that I drew from the high school classes I had, and also junior high, of course.
Yeah, certainly. And I can certainly relate from high school laboratory sciences. A lot of it comes down to memorization of facts, as opposed to teaching scientific reasoning. Even considering those deeper questions related to the scientific process. So sure, I could certainly see drawing that kind of conclusion. Do you recall any time at Penn, were there any particularly interesting classes you remember, or professors or other folks that you worked with?
Yeah, I can remember several examples. So one of the first classes I took was a philosophy of religion class with Jim Ross, who announced on the first day of class of the semester that he was going to prove that God exists and that the job of the students was to stop him. And it was this gauntlet, thrown down, which was exhilarating and really enjoyable. And I got a lot out of that. I took a course with Jerry Doppolt in aesthetics, which I found really interesting. I mean, partly because of my interest in literature. So, issues in the philosophy of art were, kind of on my mind then. I did several philosophy of science courses with Paul Fitzgerald. One of them was on space and time. And they were great. I had wonderful teachers at Penn. So
that sounds
I had
great.
another course. I had some courses with Jim Kornman, who was very demanding and rigorous. And I learned a lot about constructing and criticizing arguments from taking seminars with him. So that was good too.
And you mentioned you were concurrently interested in literature. What kind of literature?
Oh, novels, plays, poetry to a lesser extent, I guess.
Okay. Was this something you were considering writing, or more of literary criticism or evaluating some of the ideas with contained?
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in it as a scholar, not as someone who would create fiction, but as I thought of going to grad school in comparative literature or English at one point. That sort of thing. Okay,
very nice. So you're studying at Penn. What happened next? Was it a straight to graduate school from undergrad? What were you up to?
No, what happened next was I graduated and was about to get drafted and sent to Vietnam.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It was those days. And I had a very bad number to have in the lottery that was governing the draft in those days.
Oh, boy.
So I decided I should get a master's degree in education at Penn, which involved half the day at Penn doing classes and the other half day of teaching. And so that master's program got me a teaching deferment. So I avoided going to Vietnam that year by doing that. And then in the course of that year, I failed my draft physical, and so I could then go to England after that to go to grad school. Penn has this program called the Thoron Fellowship, which sends Penn undergraduates after they graduate to England to go to school, to go to university, and people with BAs from Britain to come to Penn to do graduate work. So I got one of these, and I went to Cambridge because my teachers at Penn told me that was the best place to work on philosophy of science.
Huh.
So I spent 2 years at Cambridge doing that.
That's fascinating. So how do you like Cambridge?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was the first time I'd been out of the United States, and I had lots of really great experiences in philosophy. I went to Ian Hacking's lectures then. Mary Hesse was my supervisor, and I started to work on a dissertation on simplicity, which I should explain that the PhD program in Cambridge and many other, I guess maybe all British universities in those days, was a dissertation-only degree. There were no exams or seminars required. So to work with a supervisor involved trying to find a research project. So I found that, and that interested me in part because it seemed to connect issues about art with issues about science. The simplicity of value in science, why? Is simplicity of value in art, why? So that interested me as a topic, and I worked on that, for a year and a half, I guess, with Mary Hesse.
Fascinating. So
but then I decided it was a wonderful experience there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were going to finish. So you had decided to. I'm sorry, you were finishing a thought.
Yeah, so I decided that I really should go to graduate school in America and finish there because I missed not having graduate seminars in Cambridge. And frankly, I also thought my job chances might be a bit better if I came back to America.
Sure.
I don't know why I thought that, but it was just a feeling I had. But anyhow, so I then got readmitted to Harvard. I got admitted a few years before that. But anyhow, they let me in, and I finished my PhD there in 2 years using the dissertation, which I had mostly written while I was in Cambridge. I did my graduate work backwards. I did the dissertation first, and then I took classes and took other requirements later, which is kind of bizarre.
Interesting. Yeah. How do you think that impacted your overall graduate training?
I think I ended up with a very uneven education. It was probably not great, but that's the way it worked out.
Sure.
I was able to finish Harvard in 2 years because the spring before I arrived in the fall, the faculty had abolished their giant comprehensive exam. I forget the name they used for it, but it was an exam in which you were given a list of 100 or more great works of philosophy, and you were told you would be examined on those works at some later date. And then what was happening in the 60s, I was told, was that half the class taking that exam would fail. It was, as you can imagine, very, very, very stressful. So the story I heard, this is before I arrived, was that students started to work together to prepare for this exam. And each week they would meet together, and several people would prepare one-page summaries of things like the first critique or Hume's treatise or something like that, and which sounds absurd, and I guess it was absurd, but the effect of that was the students walked into the exam and basically wrote the same exam. And the faculty then had to decide whether to pass everyone or fail everyone. And what they did was pass everybody, but decided that the requirement of this comprehensive exam had outlived its usefulness, so they abolished it. but they didn't replace it with anything. So that when I rolled in, that decision happened in the spring, and then I came to Cambridge and to Harvard in the fall, and there were not really that many requirements. I was able to finish in 2 years, which was probably not a good thing in terms of education. That's why I say I had a very uneven education, and
Sure.
That was my fault. But I decided when I got there that I was just ready to go out and teach and learn. While I was teaching, I just didn't want to be a student anymore.
Understandable.
Maybe that was a poor judgment on my part, but that's how I felt. So I was able to get a job, so I left and I came to Madison.
Very nice. So a little bit before, so about this dissertation you were working on. So could you share with us, and for more general listeners, like the main ideas in terms of understanding parsimony and simplicity in the science?
Well, I no longer believe anything I wrote in that dissertation.
Excellent.
I was very influenced by Popper in those days, and I wanted to sort of modify what he was doing and giving a theory of what parsimony and simplicity mean in science and why it's valuable. And so I invented this idea that simplicity is a kind of question relative informativeness. That was the idea. And, I tried to develop that in the dissertation. It was a real failure. I mean, it took me a year or two after I left graduate school to realize how hopeless a project it was, but I certainly did realize it, and I just sort of shelved it and put it aside, put that topic away, so much for that, find other things to work with, I said to myself. But I gradually came back to parsimony and simplicity as a philosophy of science problem, and really I spent off and on a lot of my career thinking about that, but not at all from the angle that I was using in my dissertation.
Well, it's good. It's interesting to hear the kinds of things that come from the dissertation, and generally, something that sounds like a question. I noticed you have a pretty recent book that discusses some of the issues, including the principle of parsimony. So, and we'll get to talk about that. So, how was it? How was the job search in terms of making the transition from graduate school to getting what is to become a very steady tenure track job at Madison?
Yeah, so I was on the job market starting in the fall of '73, and the market my memory of it is that the market was getting worse every in the previous couple of years, and I think what people in my class at Harvard thought was, and this turned out to be true, I guess, that we were all going to get some sort of job. Now, I don't think I didn't really doubt that was going to happen, and I think we did. And the only question was how good a job you were going to be able to get. So it was actually not. I mean, there were stressful parts of the process, but of course, the most worrisome thing of all is that you won't get a job, and that, to be honest, did not really occur to me while I was on the job market. I had several, I can't remember, it was 8 or 10 interviews at the APA, and I had two offers of positions, and chose Madison.
Very nice, very nice. Well, that's great. What was the other offer?
It was UC Santa Cruz.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay, so then you're getting to start in Madison. What was it? What was the department? What was it like back in I guess 1973? Was it?
Right, starting in '74.
Starting in '74.
So the people I became closest with philosophically here were Fred Dretsky, Dennis Stamp, Brent Dench. Those were my closest colleagues, and they were also close friends. They became close friends of mine. And I learned a lot of philosophy while I was here. There were whole areas, that were really quite adjacent to what I was already thinking about that I had never heard about, and I learned about from them. So the whole idea of externalism in epistemology, which, by this is 1974, so this was already out there, but this is an example of my very spotty education. I was just not aware of externalism as a theory or an approach to understanding what knowledge is, or justification in a reliabilist theory and so on. So this was fascinating to just learn about these things. And another thing that was going on that Fred Berendt and Denny were working on really intensively and I think very creatively in those days was naturalistic theories of content, which, if I had, it was all new to me and fascinating and exhilarating as a project. So those were great days. I felt it was great to be in this department. I learned a lot, and it was this great feeling of community, and good things were happening here.
So maybe for those who aren't completely familiar, what are how would you describe some of the different naturalistic theories of content? Well, one idea and is the idea that you can think of the content of a representation, say a belief. Why does it have the meaning it has? By thinking about the conditions that cause the representation to occur. I mean, this is very, painting with broad strokes here. Sure. So the reason something represents a bug to you is what gives it that meaning is that it's caused to occur by bugs, and it doesn't occur when you're facing a non-bug. And that would be the beginning. That would be a naturalistic theory of content. Of course, it has plenty of problems, but it's the idea that you're explaining where meaning comes from by talking about concepts like causation and correlation. You're explaining semantic facts in terms of non-semantic facts. That's broadly what the program was, and I thought that was really cool. Very nice. And at the time, it sounds like, were you spending most of your time with other philosophers, or was there some interaction with scientists?
Yeah, I was starting to get, the first couple years I was here, I started to get interested in evolutionary theory, and I'll describe how that happened. It was a very specific event, and the result of that was I started to hang out with some geneticists here and just try to learn something more about evolutionary theory. So the way this happened was I read a review in the Journal of Philosophy of Science that Bill Wimsatt wrote of this book by a biologist named George C. Williams. The book was called Adaptation and Natural Selection. And Bill, in his review of the book, there's maybe a paragraph or two in which he describes the relevance that he thought the book had for evolutionary epistemology. And I thought, that sounds interesting. I knew only a tiny bit about what evolutionary epistemology was supposed to be, but mostly out of curiosity, I went and got Williams's book, and it turned out, for me to be a life-changing event, not because it had much to do with evolutionary epistemology, but the whole question of whether natural selection causes altruism to evolve. And Williams was very critical of that idea, and the idea that group selection, competition among groups, could cause altruism to evolve was under attack in Williams's book. And I felt like the book was saturated with philosophical ideas that I was intrigued by how philosophy and science were mixed together in this book that a scientist was writing. And, having just left Harvard, I was very, influenced by Quine's idea that there's no wall between science and philosophy, that each of them bleeds into the other. So I was kind of prepared to see, to appreciate work that somehow integrates science and philosophy. And so when I read Williams's book, I thought, this is happening here. And the set of problems he was talking about, he also talked about parsimony in the book, and that was up my alley. So I just thought this is a great area, and I started to work on it. There was a small literature about this by philosophers, Bill Wimsatt being one of the people who was writing about that back in those days. So I dove into that as a philosophy of science subject and decided I was going to be a philosopher of biology. I didn't do this in grad school or earlier. I knew next to nothing about evolutionary theory then.
Wow. So this is so coming in your, so it wasn't until Madison that you really started considering doing philosophy of biology. Yeah,
that's right.
Wow. So what kinds of ideas? I mean, there certainly parsimony was in there, but what's I see a number of different. You can just go look in Google Scholar, and there's tons of articles and tons of books with which you've been working on. What might have been some of your favorites that you particularly enjoyed, or maybe some ideas that you no longer hold, sort of like with your dissertation?
Oh, you mean books that influenced me?
So I was thinking more like, maybe initial papers, or some of the papers, earlier works that you particularly liked, or potentially have some new kinds of reflection on.
Oh, so these are okay.
Things that you've written, things that you've worked on, or things that
I've written. You mean?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, the first thing I wrote about units of selection was, I think it came out in 1980 or 81. It was called Holism, Individualism, and the Units of Selection. And what I was trying to develop there was the units of selection problem, the question of whether selection favors characteristics that are good for the individual organism or characteristics that are good for the group, or something else perhaps, maybe good for the genes. That this was an instance of a problem that I guess I already knew about in philosophy of social sciences, about methodological individualism. And I thought that this was the biological problem was kind of an interesting instance of this methodological question that was familiar, and as I said, from philosophy of social science, and that it was given a kind of special shape by the way it was developed inside of biology. So in a way, the question was a better formed question in biology than it was, as I thought then, in the social sciences. So that was the thing that I was trying to do in that paper, and also trying to give a clear definition of what group selection was. It intrigued me that it was not obvious what that even meant in the literature I was looking at. I'm talking about the scientific literature here as well as the philosophical literature. And Bill Wimsatt had done some work on this to try to characterize what group selection actually meant and how it differed from individual selection. But I thought that there was room for improvement there, so I started to work on that as a kind of exercise in philosophical analysis, where the concept is a scientific concept rather than a concept from ordinary language.
Yeah, so was this something I think you carried on of doing conceptual analysis of scientific concepts?
Yeah, very much so. Analysis in the sense of giving the truth conditions for interesting concepts has always been part of what I think I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to do in philosophy, and I value that. But it's not so much capturing what individual sciences mean by a concept, but rather it's the truth conditions of the concept that they may be only dimly aware of. And the problem is to look at how the concept functions in a theory and use that setting as a way of thinking about what we ought to mean by that concept, or what its truth conditions are. And so to me it's an exercise in what Carnap and other logical empiricists called explication. It's not a descriptive definition, but it's an improvement on the concept as it currently exists in whatever community of speakers you're talking about, everyday life or the community of science.
Very nice. So I imagine, coming up in philosophy of biology, you worked on several conceptual issues related to evolutionary biology. What are some of those issues, and how did you get to come research them?
So I mentioned already units of selection as sort of the first big project I worked on. Mm-hmm. My first sabbatical I spent in Dick Lewontin's genetics lab at Harvard, and that was also a life-changing experience for me. And it was work with him, and in that period that I wrote my first book after my dissertation on, which called The Nature of Selection. It was about selection and other conceptual questions about the theory of natural selection. But while I was at Harvard, I discovered by meeting John Beattie, a philosopher of science at University of British Columbia, and Bill Fink, now at University of Michigan, who's a biologist, that parsimony was a very important concept in a part of biology, of evolutionary biology, that I didn't know anything about, called phylogenetics. That is the use of data on current species to reconstruct their genealogical relationship, to reconstruct their history of evolution. Mm-hmm. And I was unaware that this was going on, that parsimony, I didn't know anything about this subject in evolutionary biology. And I also didn't know, of course, that parsimony or anything else was an important method that was used to try to solve problems in phylogenetics. So Bill and John, as I remember it, wrote a review of I guess my dissertation, which was turned into a book, and mentioned this biological problem. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I went off and started to learn about that. And that was my next big philosophy of biology project, to try to think about parsimony as a tool in phylogenetic inference and what its justification was. This was especially interesting to me because it was controversial in biology. It wasn't like everybody thought it was right. Uh-huh. There were important voices in evolutionary biology criticizing it or describing its limitations. So that it was interesting for me to be wading into a controversy. And the same was true in the units of selection problem, my earlier project, that part of what it was intriguing about it is that there was disagreement among scientists. And I think this is, in general, an invitation for philosophers to be curious about a piece of science. When the scientists disagree, maybe there will be a philosophical dimension of why they're disagreeing, and that's of course of interest to us.
Absolutely. So, I'm generally curious. These are two big potential areas of disagreement among the scientists. Can you? I don't know. Are there any others that come to mind, or ones even more recently you've been thinking about? This is for me a smaller in terms of what I've done with it, but I've been intrigued more recently about what it means, what biologists mean or ought to mean when they say that mutations are unguided or random, and also once that's clarified, what evidence they think they have for this. That's interested me. Yeah. So what are some of your curiosities around random mutation? Like what kinds of questions do you have?
Well, I mentioned what it means and what the evidence is. Those are huge.
Those are probably the big ones. Yeah.
I've also been interested in this because of its connection with creationism and intelligent design. That often defenders of creationism and or intelligent design think that mutations are guided. They're not random. They're guided by an intelligence. And so that by itself seems to mean that standard evolutionary biology is incompatible with a certain view of God's relationship to the universe. So that is one way to think of one context in which you can think about the disagreement between evolutionary biology and creationism. Of course, another one, maybe more central, is the disagreement about what natural selection can produce in the way of complex adaptation. So a lot of creationists think that natural selection can produce some simple adaptations, but nothing like the complex, delicate adaptations we see around us, like the vertebrate eye, for example.
Sure.
So that has interested me, and I'm now free associating a bit. But one of the things that I've found interesting about the creationism debate as a topic in philosophy of science is that it's an example of, this old problem in philosophy of science called the demarcation problem. How do you separate science from non-science? And I mean, as I was leaving graduate school and starting my career, it was very common, I think it still is, for philosophers of science to dismiss the demarcation problem as a kind of discredited problem, a pseudo problem that only logical positivists could get interested in. But the current political context of the creationism versus evolutionary biology question make me think that it's not that kind of problem at all. It's an important question to think about for a philosopher of science. A lot of the controversy has to do with a philosophical question, namely, what is science? And that's for me, that's a very important question.
So what kinds of, so I have many questions from your free associations here. So have you personally been involved in any kinds of writings or, I don't know, I want to say like education in terms of responding to creationism, intelligent design issues? Yourself?
I have. I've written for philosophical audiences. I've also written articles for biologists about this. Some of that's about not using. It's the point of departure is thinking that Popper's solution to the demarcation problem is unsatisfactory, and if it is, what better ideas can be developed. I haven't written for a popular audience on that subject. That is, a non-academic audience.
Sure.
I used to give a lot of sort of public lectures about this. That seems to have subsided, possibly because of the most recent court case about this in Dover, Pennsylvania. It seems to have gone quiet a bit. Maybe it'll come back. I don't know.
Can you remind me of this? What is the most recent court case?
So this was a court case in Dover, Pennsylvania, where the school board instructed the high school biology teachers to tell their students something like the following: that evolutionary biology is a theory. There are alternatives to it. One of them is called intelligent design. And if you want to learn more about it, there's a book in the school library you can go look at. It did not insert, that was it. I mean, it's not like they said half the teaching time in high school biology has to be on creationism, but it was a much more limited kind of policy, a more limited thing that biology teachers were required to do. So what happened then was that parents and some biology teachers in this community brought suit against the school board, and the ACLU took up this case and went to trial, and the Judge Jones, ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and said that teaching intelligent design in that way, and the policy that the school board was putting in place violated the separation clause in the Constitution. So the intelligent design people lost that one.
Yeah, so I suppose given we might be having a much different conversation, or there might be quite a bit more work to do having if that court case went another way, perhaps. But
right.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was gonna let you continue.
Oh, I was just going to say that that court case was really on the same page as earlier court cases in terms of finding against creationism's intelligent design as an appropriate thing for public school, high school biology classes. So it wasn't sort of off the charts and a surprise, but it was very strongly worded, and you wonder maybe the creationists and intelligent design people have sort of given up on that project. I don't know or not.
Yeah, it's possible. I haven't followed up myself closely. I know there's a lot of popular science, more celebrity science types that are continuing the discussion a bit more. So you did mention though that the idea of philosophers of science dismissing the demarcation of problem. I would agree that that tends to be sort of a popular attitude, or that the idea that there's just perhaps more pressing problems with which to focus one's time. So I guess how could, what kind of work or what kinds of projects could philosophers of science do if they were genuinely interested in the demarcation problem?
Well, it's not that I guess it's true that, but maybe a little misleading to say that they found more important problems to work on. It was worse than that in the sense that it's not just that they found other things of more interesting. Everybody does that, sure. But it was regarded as a kind of pseudo problem, a confusion.
Sure.
And that's what came to bother me. To me, the project, the legitimate project, the project that's absolutely central to the kind of philosophy of science I think about, is to understand what testability means. And that I don't see how that could be dismissed as a pseudo problem. Scientists are happy to think about what makes a statement testable. They are involved in testing statements, and of course, if you can test a statement, then the statement is obviously testable. So it seems to me this concept is really at the center of scientific activity, and to understand what a good test is and what it takes for a statement to be testable. These are fundamental questions. It's just we need tools that Popper and his cohort back in the day had at their fingertips.
Absolutely.
But it's not a pseudo problem.
Well, it's really good to see. Is there any current work that is looking to provide more charitable understandings of these kinds of issues, or anything that you've come across lately?
I don't know about lately, and that's just my failure to keep up with things because I haven't worked on it lately. But
Sure.
Sometime, like more than a decade ago, I published a paper called Testability, and this kind of idea to talk about what's wrong with intelligent design. So I think there's, I tried to develop the concept of testability in a probability framework using the concept of likelihood. So that's how I've tried to work on it. But I mean, there's plenty of work for other people to do here. I don't regard it as a kind of solved problem now, but like I said, I moved on to other things, and I haven't really worked on that recently.
Cool. Well, great. No, that'd be really interesting to look at. And I mean, just as in the sense that this particular problem has been dismissed as a pseudo problem, I mean, it's quite possible. Well, there might be other problems in the philosophy of science that certainly have been dismissed that certainly could still be attended to in some kind of way. None readily come to mind. You would probably be more familiar with them, but definitely something to think about. Let's move on. I'm really interested in hearing about your fairly new book. Let's see here. It is called Occam's Razors, a User's Manual. So tell us a little bit about this. How did this book come to fruition?
So part of so I mentioned earlier that I got back after my dissertation. I let parsimony go away, and then I came back to it because of biologists using parsimony and phylogenetic inference. And I wrote a book called Reconstructing the Past that was about that. That was in 1988. Mm-hmm. And then in the 90s, my colleague Malcolm Forster and I stumbled another gold mine that he and I found out about kind of by accident, namely this work in a part of statistics called model selection theory, mm-hmm. and in particular some work from the 70s done by a Japanese statistician named Aki. And he and I worked on that together, and we wrote our first paper about Aki-Ike's information criterion. It was published in 1994. And that whole area has continued to interest me too. So I had one framework for thinking about parsimony in cladistics, in evolutionary biology, mm-hmm. which was, and then this second thing came along, namely the way parsimony is used as a criterion in model selection theory. And so that was, as I said, that work began in the 90s with Malcolm. Mm-hmm. And the new book is about both of those things, both the phylogenetic idea, which is, I think, fruitfully connected to the idea of likelihood, mm-hmm. and then the quite separate way that parsimony gets understood in model selection theory and statistics. So those are the two, to me, big picture ideas that I think provide a lot of insight into why parsimony matters in science. It's not the whole story, but those are two big parts of the story, I think.
So,
but then,
go ahead.
I was going to say what else is in the book, and some of it's new given what I had done before. Namely, the first chapter is a kind of 50 or 60 page history of different episodes in philosophy, in the history of philosophy and the history of science, in which parsimony has mattered to scientists and what philosophers have said about it. And I hadn't really done much in the way of historical work on Occam's razor before, but with help from, for example, my colleague Paula Gottlieb, I got interested in Aristotle's principle that nature does nothing in vain, which seems like an anticipation of Occam's razor, and also interested in what Occam himself thought about this, and mm-hmm. Newton and Leibniz and Hume's principle of the uniformity of nature as a kind of parsimony principle, and so on. So it's that sort of work in history.
Oh, that's great.
Interested me a lot. I should say that what I learned about Occam himself, yeah. I owe a lot to a colleague I had when I was at Stanford, Rega Wood, who really helped me a great deal understand what Occam was up to. So that was fantastic.
So, yeah.
So I had a lot of help on this part of the book, and as well as on the other parts, too.
So, absolutely. So, and we hear the term Occam's razor used a lot, especially in popular science and in a lot of terrible science fiction movies. What can you say maybe about some potential misunderstandings folks might have with Occam's razor that you can maybe provide some clarity to in the book?
Well, it's, one thing that comes to mind is that the principle that says that simpler theories are better than more complex theories, and does not rely on the assumption that nature is simple. That the justifications that both come out of likelihood and phylogenetic inference issues, and also out of model selection ideas and statistics, neither of them rely on that assumption. So that's kind of, to me, a sort of important basic insight that these different frameworks are providing.
Yeah, absolutely. And how is it that this you apply or come to understand the roles of parsimony through probability theory?
That's kind of hard to explain,
unpack probably in a short sentence.
Just so where if I had a blackboard in 5 minutes, I could probably do something with it. But I don't really want to try to get into.
I
that
can tell
now.
them, yeah. People can go read the book. I think that's also that they can do too. But
I mean, I can provide a little hint as to what the basic idea is, but how it gets developed and used to understand parsimony it will not be clear from what I can say now. Shall I go ahead anyhow?
Yeah, sure. If you want to, yeah, sure.
Okay, so here's an example that will illustrate what statisticians mean by the idea of likelihood, which is different from the idea of probability.
Mm-hmm.
So, suppose you have an urn in front of you. It's filled with balls, and each ball has some color or other. And you draw 100 balls out, and 90% of them are green.
Mm-hmm.
And then you consider two hypotheses. The first hypothesis says all the balls in the urn are green. And the second hypothesis says only 5% of the balls in the urn are green. Now, I hope it's intuitive to the people listening to think that what you observe, that 90 out of 100 balls are green, that favors the first hypothesis over the second.
Mm-hmm.
That it's evidence in favor of all of them are green as opposed to only 5% are green. There's a second step to this idea. Consider how probable it is that you'd get 90 out of 100 green if the first hypothesis were true, that is, if all the balls in the urn are green. It's not that improbable that you get 90 out of 100. On the other hand, if only 5% of the balls in the urn were green, it'd be very improbable that you'd get 90 out of 100 in the sample you drew. So that is idea goes by the name likelihood. When statisticians will say that the first hypothesis, the 100% hypothesis, has a higher likelihood because it makes the observations more probable than the second hypothesis, the 5% hypothesis, does. So the likelihood of a hypothesis is not how probable the hypothesis is, it's how probable the hypothesis says your observations are. So that's the idea of likelihood. Okay. And I hope it has, from what I've just said, a kind of intuitive appeal. Yeah, likelihood is maybe a good way to think about interpreting evidence. It's a good way of thinking about why the evidence you got from your sampling the urn favors the first hypothesis over the second. So that's what likelihood is. What's not obvious from what I've said is how that would help you understand parsimony. Mm-hmm. But that's a big project that's discussed at length in the book. There are ways in which hypotheses that differ in parsimony often differ in how likely they are in this technical sense that I just described, so that likelihood gives you a justification for thinking that more parsimonious theories are better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, a lot of the assumption from, as you mentioned, the sort of the more incomplete or understanding in terms of simpler theories being better mirrors of a simpler nature that is simpler. If nature isn't simple, or we're not basing it on the assumption, we have to get this sense that simple is better from some other way.
That's the idea. Good. Yeah. That's right.
Cool. And insert probability theory. And that's really great. That sounds fascinating. How's the book been received so far?
I've got some. I mean, I'm pleased with the reviews that have appeared. I'm happy with that. Good.
I know it's fairly new. So, no, that's great. So we're coming to the end. We've learned quite a bit about a very fascinating upbringing of yourself, going a little bit backwards through graduate programs, finding a serendipitous path into the philosophy of science and philosophy of biology, working with famous geneticist Richard Lewontin. Is there anything else, Dr. Sober, that you would like to share with us? Anything currently going on, or anything you'd like to plug, or any research you'd like to discuss?
Here's one thing, and it's an impression I have, which may be wrong, which is that I've had the feeling that philosophy of science has become less important to the rest of philosophy than was true 30 years ago, let's say. And I don't know, I can't really document this, but I feel like if you did a Steinberg map of philosophy, the way Steinberg did a map of, New York being in the middle and other places being scattered around it, I feel like philosophy of science would be less central and less important on that Steinberg map now than before.
This would be an interesting question.
I think it'd be interesting to trace, if that's right. If that's true, it'd be interesting to trace out like why that happened. That's I think an interesting problem in the sociology of knowledge. But I won't speculate about that here. But sure. I do want to urge philosophers of science to redouble their efforts to connect what they're doing with other areas of philosophy. We are relevant to other parts of philosophy, and I think we need to try harder to make it clear why that's so. Our future as a discipline, I think, depends on our having good relationships with the rest of philosophy. No one else is going to hire us except once in a while. Yeah. So this is a life and death thing in the long term. So I would urge philosophers of science to think about that and recognize the importance of having audiences that are not philosophers of science, other philosophers, and of course, philosophers of science don't need to be reminded that the audience of science itself is very important for us too. But that's less of a concern to me in terms of the future of the discipline than our relationships to the rest of philosophy.
I think that's really important, and I know at Indiana where I'm studying, there's definitely now an increased push to connect where we have our own department of history and philosophy of science, but there is a whole other philosophy department with which at least a number of faculty and graduate students are connecting through things such as the cognitive science program, or also connecting by taking some biology classes, etc. But I think you're absolutely right that the pressure, or the emphasis has often the case been on connecting with philosophers of science as well as scientists, but not so much relating as how important philosophy of science is to the rest of the philosophy and how the two are connected. There's almost been at times an emphasis to distinguish philosophy of science from philosophy, unfortunately. And sometimes people think that's a good idea, and though other times it has consequences. So so really quickly, just I don't want to keep you too long. How could philosophers of science better connect or make themselves more relevant or strengthen their relationships with other kinds of philosophers?
This is one way is to keep your ears open for ideas that are being discussed in other areas of philosophy that have a philosophy of science dimension to them, perhaps. And once you recognize that, maybe that would be a writing project, to talk about that problem where you go into the philosophy of science side a bit more deeply than the non-philosophers of science are doing, and that would be a new angle for that problem, which has originated outside of philosophy of science.
Not about it. Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. Well, that was a very nice ending and very nice conclusion, and some great advice. So, Elliot, I just want to thank you once again for coming to talk with us. It's been a real pleasure to chat and to hear a little bit more about your story. It's tremendous. Any recent plans for this fun things for this spring semester?
Oh, I'm working on an article now about the fine-tuning argument, which I've written about a couple times before, but I have an invitation to write something about it again. So I'm hard at work on that now. That's going to occupy my time for a while. So that's my new project.
Okay,
now.
Fantastic. Well, best of luck on that, and I hope you have a terrific spring. And if I see you around the conference circuit, I'll be sure to say hello.
Great. Good talking to you, Nick. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Elliot. Take care.